Yeah, g'day YouTubers, Tinker O'Toole again with another video. Today I'm going to talk about offset grinding on a chainsaw grinder, and it's interesting because I'll show you 4 different chainsaw grinders and the setup is different on them, but the one that's probably the most complicated of all, if we want to put it that way, would be the Stihl USG grinder. The one that you see here, this is a typically, I think it's about a 510 or it could be a 511 clone, one or the other anyway. And for the most part, we do our grinding that's not offset unless we do 10 degrees downward tilt on full chisel. And what I mean by offset grinding, for those that are not familiar with offset grinding, is that if we come around here and we have a look at the center of the wheel where the bolt is, then when we bring the grinding wheel down, what I want you to look at is that we're looking in the center of that bolt lines up exactly in the middle of the chain. All right, so that's where it lines up at. And as that grinding wheel gets smaller and smaller, it can become slightly offset. And it doesn't cause too much trouble, but nonetheless, on the more expensive grinders, you can compensate for them. Whereas this one, you're very limited in what you can compensate for. But nonetheless, they do a fantastic job. So we'll just go over the offset grinding on this particular grinder. What this grinder has is on this scale here, which is a top plate scale. So this movable vise rotates to the desired position of the top plate, and that's normally either 25 degrees or 30 degrees for your semi-chisel. For your full chisel, you have the option of offset grinding. And that means that if you're going to do a right-hand tooth, you will push this knob away from you, and you can see that the vise tilts in that direction. When it tilts, that moves it away from the center line, and that's what we refer to offset grinding. So that was a left-hand tooth, which is the tooth faces closest to the grinder. And if you want to do a right-hand tooth, which is where it's set up at the moment, that's the tooth facing closest towards you, the operator. So left-hand tooth, you'll pull it towards you like that. Then it's just a matter of putting it in the correct position, tilting this over. I like to have 50 degrees on the grinder, all right? 50 degrees here, 30 degrees here, 10 degrees downward tilt. It'll have offset grinding, and that will mean essentially that the tooth will be off the center line. Now, on other type of grinders, you've got a movable sliding vise. The actual vise slides backwards and forwards. And we're going to have a look at 2 of those grinders that have the slidable vise rather than the tiltable vise. So the next one that we're going to look at will be a Jolly Star. So we've got a Jolly Star. Then the slidable vise, we've got a Jolly Evo. These are both from Taconic. And the last one, which is probably the most complicated in geometry terms, would be the Stihl USG grinder. So we'll look at the whole 4, and hopefully you'll have a much better understanding of offset grinding. Another way to explain offset grinding, we could also use the term offset filing. So if we have a look at a chainsaw tooth, and this is a replica, and we're to hold a file in this position, which is parallel, right, with the tooth, the top plate angle, if we lower this down 10 degrees, you'll notice that you've got a gap there. And if you start filing, you're going to start to file the front of the tooth before you start to file the back of the tooth again. So you could call this offset filing because you're offsetting the file from 90 degrees. You're lowering it down an additional 10 degrees. So that could be referred to offset filing because it's different than the standard filing position. And this is exactly the same on this type of grinder. You are offsetting the grinding wheel, and when you offset the grinding wheel from the center line, it'll have an effect on the top plate angle of about 2.5 degrees. It'll have an effect on the top plate angle at 2.5 degrees. So this 10 degrees downward tilt both affects the top plate cutting angle and the top plate. Now, for those that are not 100% familiar with that, when we look at a tooth, there are two angles on here. This is the top plate angle, the 30 degrees. That's the angle there. And the top plate cutting angle is the angle that's on this face here. So this is what we call a compounded beveled angle, because you've got two angles. You've got the angle on top and you've got the angle that it cuts at. And it is normally set between 50 and 60 degrees. The grinding wheel comes down on this angle. Or in the case of a file, the whole idea that if you keep your file between 20 and 25% above this point, it will create an angle right at the tip of 60 degrees approximately. That's the side plate angle. So the next we're going to do is have a look. Now, I've got two of these grinders. There's another one just over there. They're not too bad. They're only a fairly cheap grinder. They're a clone, as I said. I think it's a Oregon 5. Could be just 511. Then when you go to the Oregon 511AX, it's a little bit different. But nonetheless, they're actually made very well. All aluminium. There's a little bit of plastic in them, but not much at all. And they've got all the features that you need to do proper grinding on your chainsaw chain, whether it's 1/4 inch chain right up to 404 chain. So we'll have a look at the next grinder for offset grinding. So as I said before, when we're offset grinding, all it really means is that we're grinding off the center line. And when you grind off the center line, it affects the top plate cutting angle and the top plate angle. So we'll look at the next one. Okay, so this is the second one, the Jolly Star. And it's a little bit different, but it's got a tiltable vise. But also, it compensates for 10 degrees downward tilt on the top plate cutting angle. And if we zoom in there, we'll show you that. So what you need to do with this now is that you've got a 2.5 degree additional angle that you need to put on here if you do top plate cutting angle. So if you set it at 60 degrees, right, so we'll just do that. So there's our 60 degrees. And if you have a look here, it says 0 angle. So we'll just, that's our 0 angle there, 60 degrees. And what you need to do now, where it's got 10 degrees down, right? So if we just move this, you'll see that there's another mark called 10 degrees down, right? So we'll just tighten it up a little bit. If we put this, that's standard 60 degrees, right? And if you push this over a little bit more where it's got 10 degrees down, can you see I've covered up the 60 degrees by another 2.5 degrees, right? So there's our 60 degree mark there. And our 62.5 degree mark is there where it's got 10 down. On this face here, I'll just get a pointer and I'll point to that face, just in case you can't see it. There's two faces. This face here is 0 degrees angle. And if we go in, you'll see this is recessed back a little bit, see? So that's 10 degrees down. Now, so just to repeat that again for those that don't know, when you use 10 degrees tilt, downward tilt, on this particular grinder, it wants you to compensate for an additional 2.5 degrees. So you lose 2.5 degrees. So they add 2.5 degrees on. So On 10 degrees downward tilt, this will be set to 62.5. On the top plate, you will also lose. So there's compensation for that as well. And if you actually look, we'll just see whether you can see this even better. We'll see if we can come right down and you can see this. You'll see at the front there, you'll see the 0 degrees right in the middle. And either side of that, you'll see 10 down. That's 2.5 degrees off. So an example is if we set that at 30 degrees, 10 degrees down is 2.5 degrees. So there it is there. There's your 2.5 degree difference. So you set that at 30 degrees. Put that on 30. So really now you've got 32.5. So that's what part of the offset grinding is. So this one is exactly the same as the other one. When we talk about the 10 degrees downward tilt, that you loosen this, you tilt it that way or you tilt it back the other way. When you tilt it, this is when you use the 2.5 degrees offset on the top plate and 2.5 degrees on the top plate cutting angle. And that will bring it back to, let's just say you set this at 60 degrees and you set this at 30. If you were to measure it accurately, you would find out that when you do use these offsets, that you will retain that 60 degrees here and that 30 degrees. On the other type grinders that don't have the offset, and that's probably most grinders don't have it, then you'll find out that you'll be 2.5 degrees less than what you should be. However, what you can do, if you don't have these offsets built on the grinder, you can just add 2.5 degrees and that will be okay. Now, the next grinder we're going to look at doesn't have these tiltable vices like this. It uses a slideable vice. So we're going to look at the Taconic Jolly Evo, and then we'll look at the Stihl USG grinder that has both slideable vices, and we'll talk about the offset grinding on those. Okay, so the next grinder we got, which is a lot cheaper by about $150. This was about $270. The Jolly Star was about $400. So significantly cheaper, but nonetheless, this is still a high quality end grinder. Now, it's probably a little bit more modern than the Jolly Star as far as it's got a slide-in vise. And a slide-in vise can be used for two things. You can use it to line up with the grinding wheel as the grinding wheel wears down, so that if you've got an offset of 1 millimeter or a degree, it's a degree scale on here. So let's just say the grinding wheel wore down a bit and you set it to 1 degree. If you had 10 degrees downward tilt, then that's just a matter, if it's already on 1 degree, then you would go to 11 degrees and 9 degrees on this side. So that's the way that that works. You've got the combination of using this, if you choose to do so, to line up the wheel, and you just record what it is, and then you just add that on. So this does offset grinding exactly the same, and we can just tilt this vise out of the way and come over here and zoom in, and we can have a look at the vise. Now the same thing is accomplished on this type of vise as a tiltable vise. It's a sliding vise. And what it actually does, and when we loosen the knob here, is it moves away from the grinding wheel, whether you're doing a left-hand tooth or a right-hand tooth. So it achieves exactly the same thing. You are offsetting this to 10 degrees in that direction, right? Or 10 degrees in that direction. It just depends what tooth that you're doing. So it's just a matter of loosening that and putting in the right direction. So it's pretty straightforward and simple to use. If you ask me which one I like best, I prefer the older style than the sliding vise. And the reason, while I will admit that the sliding vise is more universal because you can use it for the wheel alignment to make sure that it's sitting in the right spot, many times I have forgotten and ground the chain when it's not in the right spot. Done that quite a few times. Whereas on the tiltable vise, because you can tilt it, it's in plain view that it's tilted. So it's pretty hard to grind without making that mistake. It's in plain view. Whereas if you're standing in front of the grinder and you got distracted for a minute, you could turn this without pulling the vise forwards or back. Depends whether you're doing the left or right. So when you're working in front, it's so easy to forget if you get slightly distracted. So it's just happened a couple of times to me. And that's why I don't like using the slidable vise. Whereas when you use this type of vise, it's pretty easy to see that that's tilted up in the air. I mean, you can see this part here. You can just see it's tilted. So it's pretty easy to see. Whereas this, when you tilt it backwards and forwards a little bit, the only way that you really know is the distance between here or there. So, yeah, that's the only thing. There's no, look, that's a user error. Like a lot of things, they're user errors. But quite simply, it does exactly the same thing, whereas the tiltable vise moves like that. It opens outwards, whereas this type of vise moves that way. It achieves exactly the same thing. It's offset grinding. Simple as that. And it doesn't compensate. There's no compensation of adding another 2.5 degrees here or another 2.5 degrees there. You could do that yourself, just add it on. So if you were doing 60 degrees on here, you put 62.5. If you're doing 30 degrees on here, you put 32.5 degrees. So you could do it that way without a problem. It's up to you whether you want to do it. Personally, I do it because I'm aware of it. One thing about this subject is the more you get involved into this subject, the more you learn about it and you realise the mistakes that you can make. And on the cheaper grinders, they don't compensate for offset grinding 100%. This does not compensate 100% for offset grinding where the Jolly Star does. And the next one, the last one, is the Stihl USG grinder, which compensates 100% for offset grinding. It's built into the grinder without adjusting anything. And we'll go over that next. Okay, so I thought I'd leave the best to last. Stihl USG grinder, universal sharpening grinder. So when I got this home, I unboxed it and assembled it all. And I thought, oh, I'll check the radius of the wheel. So I thought I'll put it at 0 because it's always good to hold the wheel in a vertical position so that when you're looking at it, you're looking at symmetrical and you can dress it accordingly. And when I looked at it like this, I thought, oh, I mustn't have put it on 0 because you can see that it's on a tilt. It's on an angle. I thought, oh, that's odd. So I went and had a look and I thought, no, that's on 0. Why is it tilted? That's a bit odd. Anyway, I tried again. No, that's the way the grinder is. On 0, it's got a slight tilt. Why is that? Well, if you remember before, we spoke about the Jolly Star, and on the top plate cutting angle, on the back, you saw that it had 2 settings. Standard and 10 degrees downward tilt, or 0 degrees. So you could set it at 60 degrees and it would be on 60. If you had 10 degrees downward tilt, you would set it on that 10 down, and that would give it an additional 2.5 degrees. So if you wanted a 60 degree angle, you would set it at 62.5, and here on the top plate, it had exactly the same thing. It had 3 notches, one for the left, one for the right, 0 in the middle. And if you had 10 degrees downward tilt, you would adjust it accordingly with 2.5 degrees offset. So you had 2.5 degrees offset on here and 2.5 on here. Now the Stihl USG grinder has 3 degrees offset on here. That's why it sits slightly crooked, right? Another thing, we've got a pivot point here. So on this scale, this C scale here, I've put a black line on here. You'll be able to see that black line. We'll zoom in. You can see that quite easily. That's the pivot point where the scale pivots. But when you put a chain on there, the point of the chain is out here. And what that actually means is that the tooth is going to move across the face of the wheel by about 12 millimeters. And that's a huge offset. And that's the way it's designed, and that's the way it works. And we'll have a look at that. So we'll set it up and we'll show you how it moves across the face of the wheel. Okay, so when we look at that, I've got a bit of masking tape there. It's right in the center of the wheel. And you can see the tooth, I've marked it in red texture. Now what I'm going to do is rotate the C scale to 30 degrees, and you'll see how much the tooth moves away from the center line. Okay, so that's 30 degrees. Now because I've got the tooth a little bit more forwards, it's going to move a little bit more. So being offset by 17 millimeters from the pivot point, the more and more that you come forwards, the more it pivots and the more it moves away from the center line. So the true position is back a little bit. But nonetheless, if we bring the grinding wheel down at that point there, so that's the true point where the grinding wheel is, and if we rotate, the same thing, you'll see that it moves way past, and if you rotate it that side, it moves way past as well. So that's offset grinding, right? That's what offset grinding will do. So we're not worried about this being sitting perfectly horizontal at 0 degrees. It doesn't. Sitting perfectly horizontal, it is at, and we'll just adjust it at perfect horizontal. Okay. That's about, I'll just give it a touch more. That's perfect horizontal. And at perfect horizontal, on the scale, it's -3. Now, if you look at the A scale, it goes from -15 to +50 degrees. So -15 degrees, +50 degrees. That covers everything for hedge trimmers. I think hedge trimmers is -10. Chainsaw and circular saws. On the B scale here, the B scale, and we'll just take the camera over there, is set up -40, 0 at that end, and +40 that end. So that's set up like that. It's a much larger scale than an Oregon style grinder. Oregon style grinder is usually about minus and +15 degrees. So this is a lot larger. And the C scale is larger as well. Typical Oregon style grinder goes 0 in the middle and 35 degrees left and right. You've got 60 degrees to the left and 60 degrees to the right. So they're large scales. Now, the reason, if we have a look at the Jolly Star, on the back scale, which is top plate cutting angle, you had the offset 2.5 degrees. Here, you've got an offset of 3 degrees. All right, same thing, just a little bit different. The vise, if you look at the chart that it comes with, if you're doing semi-chisel or full chisel, you've got -15, +15. Then you've got your scale here. So what we actually did to check the accuracy of this was we took a hexa chain, and a hexa chain is 25 degrees. on the A scale and 25 degrees on the C scale and 0 on the vice. But remember, we have to add the 3 degrees on here. So 25 degrees becomes 28. But because the scale, the center point, the pivot point, the tooth is 17 millimeters in front of that, we end up, as this is working as compensating, because it works off the center line to the left and offset to the center line to the right equally. So it compensates for any error as the wheel wears down. And we measured the tooth and we had exactly 25 degrees on the top plate cutting angle. So even though it's 28 degrees to start with, because of all the offset that you've got between the A scale and the C scale, it brought it back into spec. And that is where I sort of got a little bit confused about how this USG grinder works with the offset. So, and it's really a good idea in one way, because it means that as the wheel gets smaller and smaller, you don't have to compensate for that. On chainsaw grinders that have a vise on the side, you can compensate. You can put a steel ruler in there and you can say, okay, this is minus 1 degree to be perfectly in the middle. The wheel's worn down a little bit. So let's just say it's minus 1 degree. That's the new center line. And you've got to do 10 degrees downward tilt on the slidable vise. Well, you're already minus 1. So if you add another 10 degrees, you'll be minus 11. On this side, you'll be 9. So you'll be 9 on one side, 11 on the other. So that's a manual adjustment. But with the Stihl USG, because the way that the tooth moves across the center line and the way that it's offset and the way that you put the vise, minus 15, positive 15, 3 degrees on here, everything comes into spec. So this grinder is designed so with all the offsetting, and as the wheel gets smaller, you don't have to worry about wheel compensation. It's almost like it's automatic. It's been engineered in such a way that if there is a little error, it's so small, it's not even worth worrying about. But it's pretty darn close. It's taken me a number of years to figure this grinder out, because everything about this grinder is the opposite to an Oregon. And an example is this. Okay, let's just say we're going to do something at 30 degrees, which is equivalent to 60 degrees on an Oregon. Okay, so we tilt that and it tilts to the left. We put a chain in, and if we stand at the back here, our left-hand tooth is closest to the operator and a right-hand tooth is closest to the back plate. Yet, if we look at an Oregon style grinder, the head tilts to the right-hand side. Right? Total opposite. And when we put a chain in, a left-hand tooth is at the back plate and a right hand is at the operator. So it's totally reverse of that. So, you know, you can get confused. Now, remember, this is a fairly precision type piece of equipment that's designed for chainsaws. It's designed for hedge trimmers and circular saw blades. So it is different. It uses a different, if we want to call it a reference point, if you look at a protractor, vertical reference point on a protractor is 90 degrees. We don't have a vertical reference point on here because 0 degrees is offset by 3 degrees. So when we put this head in the 90 degree position, as you would on an Oregon, the scale over here reads -3 degrees, right? That's no big deal. That's just the way it is. It's the way it's set up. This grinder, with all its offsetting, compensates for the angle that you set. As the wheel wears down, it compensates for it all. It's designed that way. I hope I've explained that reasonably well. The video's gone for quite a while, but it's like any other subject. The more you actually get into the subject, the more things that you find out. So that's what I found out in the last 2 years, that this particular chainsaw, with all its offsetting, compensates as the wheel wears down much better than an Oregon style chainsaw grinder, because of the way that you got your offset here and your offset angle on your A scale. So the 3 scales work really well together. Your A scale for your top plate cutting angle, your B scale for your slidable vise, and your C scale for your top plate angle. The combination of these 3 angles cancels any error out, irrespective if the wheel wears down. That's simple. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.